Hello.
Hi, Edie.
Hi,
I'm
Edie.
sorry,
Good
I'm-
morning.
Good morning.
I'm coming with my last background. So,
You wanted to change your background. Okay, legitimate reason. Okay, welcome. Good morning, Edie, and over to you, George.
Thanks, Ian. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues, and welcome to this first dialogue series being hosted by the Lancet COVID Commission and Unicef Global Development Commons. My name is George Laya J. I'm the Director of Evaluation at Unicef, and we are co-hosting this event together with Her Excellency President Valerie the former President of Latvia, and Madame Gabrielle Cuevas, a Member of Parliament in Mexico. Today, we'll be looking specifically at how COVID has hit various groups of vulnerable people, the elderly, children, young people, women, disabled, indigenous people, various groups, and how and of course, including those in humanitarian situations. And we'll be looking at how the important instrument on social protection are helping such groups to cope, and what more governments, international actors could do. So again, welcome. I'd like to invite the Executive Director of Unicef, Ms. Henrietta Fore, and Professor Jeffrey Sachs to open the meeting. A few words about them, and I'll start with Executive Director Fore, who is my boss. I'm glad to see her with us this morning. She has been with UNICEF for almost 3 years now, and the transformation that she's brought to get us to focus more strongly on what bring big changes in the lives of young people, in the lives of children. She comes from a background of both public sector and private sector, and that helps us think outside the box. She was a director of the U.S. Mint in the Department of Treasury, as well as was the head of the U.S. State Management, Secretary of State for Management Affairs. She brings a great deal of wealth and of experience in this area that we're going to discuss, having initiated reforms in USAID, as well as in a current role. Edie, we're pleased that you can join us. And perhaps also to introduce Professor Sachs, many of you know him. He is championing the Lancet COVID Commission work. We know about his boldness and the strategies that he's brought to various crises. I'm happy to say that when I was a young man in my own government, and we welcomed him to help us. At that time, Jeff, you were doing the macro economic commission on the social determinants of health, and you helped us unpack what works and helped us to seek the right investments to push an ambitious health agenda. In addition, with the MDGs, you also helped us to push for an ambitious agenda, overcoming the constraints of the national market. So I'm not going to say much about Jeff because we all know him well, and I'd like to warmly welcome the two of them. So Edie, over to you. If you could share your inspiration, as always, with us in this forum, and then Jeff will come in as well. Over to you, please.
thank you very much. George, and I will sound very formal because we have Madam President with us. So let me sound formal. So Madam President, co-chairs, Professor Sachs, honored guests, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of UNICEF, we want to thank everyone for joining us for this very important discussion, the first learning exchange between UNICEF's Global Development Commons and the Lancet's COVID-19 Commission. It's increasingly clear that COVID-19 is not only a health crisis, but also an economic one with very concerning impacts on poverty. For the first time in 20 years, after nearly a quarter century of steady global declines, we expect to see an increase in global extreme poverty in 2020, with as many as 115 million additional people living on less than $1.90 per day. Depending on the level of economic contraction, this increase could reach 150 million people next year. For children, this is a crisis. They're already twice as likely to live in poverty as adults. This crisis will affect every aspect of children's lives, from their health and education to their families' ability to provide quality nutrition for their growth and development. As the global community responds to COVID-19, we must pay particular attention to this challenge, and we are. Social protection has already been a critical part of the response, and we've seen what a positive difference that it can make in the lives of families that are struggling to make ends meet. More than 200 countries have increased their social protection programming, including over 150 that have increased their cash transfer programming. These interventions are helping families improve their access to vital health, education, and nutrition, while also supporting local economies. At UNICEF, we are proudly supporting over 100 countries with our partners. In Thailand, for example, we joined forces with ILO, IOM, and UN Women to help the government expand existing child support grants, disability grants, and old age allowances, benefiting around 8 million people. In Tajikistan, we worked with the government to make social protection systems more responsive to shocks such as COVID. This includes developing operating procedures and emergency protocols to help national programs rapidly respond to COVID and similar emergencies. But despite our progress, we face significant work ahead. So far, the response has been largely focused on short-term impacts, but we must also ensure that these systems can support longer-term recovery and any future shocks to come. We know that countries with strong systems and high coverage are better able to respond to COVID, but overall coverage remains low. For example, 2 out of 3 children globally have no access to a child or family benefit at all. Of course, we're all facing budgetary challenges ahead, and these systems will need significant funding. But this crisis has shown how necessary these protections are as economies recover from COVID and prepare for future shocks. That's why today's discussion is so important. The expert views on this panel can help us to identify the most effective ways to help governments design, deliver, and fund truly sustainable and inclusive social protection systems. Thank you all for lending your ideas and vision to this critical work, and UNICEF is proud to be working with you. So with that, may I turn it back over to you, George, and welcome Professor Sachs.
Thank you very much, Edie, for those words. And indeed, I'll hand over to Professor Sachs to help us and frame the issues and to open the dialogue as well. Over to you, Jeff.
George, thank you so much. Henrietta, thank you so much for your leadership and your partnership and all that UNICEF is doing. Madam President, thank you for, as always, your great leadership, including on the Lancet COVID-19 Commission, which is one of the partners for today's discussion. We're in a profound humanitarian crisis. We don't really even know the depths of the crisis, and we don't know the dynamics of the crisis because there remains much that is very unpredictable about the pandemic. How fast it can be brought under control, most importantly. Without control of the pandemic, we will not be able to stay alongside the humanitarian needs. And so ending this pandemic through public health measures and through the new vaccines that are coming online and making sure that they are equitably available around the world is of paramount importance for the coming year. But we know that the social and humanitarian crises are profound and deepening. The World Food Program has indicated repeatedly in recent weeks that as many as a dozen countries may be facing imminent famine. The reason being that livelihoods have been lost, remittance income has plummeted, terms of trade has been adversely affected in many countries, and so incomes of the poor have been lost or are sharply down for people who survive on the edge of subsistence, and the risks are therefore devastating. The demands on governments are very high, but revenues of governments have plummeted. Governments are needed to address the urgent health needs, the systems needs for equipment, for testing, for contact tracing teams, now for vaccines. Governments are needed for social protection. Governments are needed for emergency measures for safety and to replace lost income of desperately poor people. And yet the means for poor countries to do this has, of course, diminished or even collapsed. We therefore have crises of public health financing, hunger, school crises for hundreds of millions of kids who are not in school and are not connected by internet to be online. And Unicef, again, has taken a lead to try to address these harrowing conditions. So this is what brings us to our discussion today, what to do. And I think that there are at least two major aspects of the what to do. The first is to identify what are these crises, where are they occurring, how do we ensure that we have timely, relevant information, because hunger can be a hidden killer. If we're not assiduous in seeking the information, we will miss a lot of the underlying disaster. A lot of suffering takes place quietly and outside of the media, and this is what we need to know. Then second, how do we address it? And of course, what is most importantly missing in all of this is the financing for low-income countries. Rich countries are spending vast sums, trillions of dollars on borrowed money. Interest rates are very low. Central banks, in fact, are buying a lot of the debt, so it is literally issuing new money to cover the gaps. But in crises like this, that is warranted and possible to do for rich countries with stable currencies. But for poor countries that lack foreign exchange, that have lost external earnings, that have lost tourist earnings, travel and service earnings, terms of trade losses, and so forth, this is not possible. And so trillions spent in the rich countries and a deepening crisis in the poor. And then the question is, where is the funding going to come from? Now, today, I think there was an interesting story that gives us a good idea. The Asian Development Bank announced today, and it's in the Financial Times, a new facility for highly concessional borrowing for $9 billion for vaccine rollout in Asia. This tells us that the multilateral development banks can, with proper attention and support of their boards, massively increase the availability of emergency funding. We need the African Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Islamic Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and other multilateral development banks to be empowered by their boards to use their borrowing capacities, their paid-in capital, to increase urgently the access to humanitarian financing. That's number one. Second, we need the International Monetary Fund to be empowered with another round of emergency, fast dispersing, low conditionality funds. In 2020, about 80 countries received around $100 billion from emergency credit facilities of the IMF, but that channel is tapped out. And unfortunately, the Trump administration was blocking very reasonable alternatives, but we'll have a new government and a new opportunity on the board of the IMF to move quickly and urgently with new rounds of urgent low conditionality financing. Third, I would like us to revisit the UN core budget, because the UN core budget is the world's greatest bargain, but it is too much of a bargain because we need UN funds and agencies, including UNICEF and others, to have more funding available in the core budget. Not through begging, but through the core budget. Right now, the core budget is about $3 billion a year for running the UN system. It's sad because $3 billion a year is rounding error for the world, but the UN is the bulwark of the world system. It is the set of institutions holding the world together. And so I think we need a serious look. I'm for a 10-time increase of the core budget. And of course, I'm a crazy voice, but we need to think honestly about the scale of how we invest in staying afloat as a world society. And the UN is our greatest hope and source for that. And the fourth area is urgent philanthropic contributions. Now, let me indicate the weird state of affairs this year. Most of the world has gotten poorer, but the richest people have gotten richer at a faster rate than at any time in world history. You can go on the Bloomberg website, bloomberg.com, and type in billionaires, and you can get the daily net worth of the richest 500 people on the planet. I am a kind of billionaire voyeur. I like to see how they're doing day to day, because it helps us to understand the nature of the world. The 500 richest people in the world have a net worth now. I'm a few days out of date, but it is about what I'm going to tell you, of $7.4 trillion. 500 people, $7.4 trillion. Now, more to the point, their wealth has increased since January 1, increased by $1.4 trillion. It's beyond imagining what's happening. Our market system is going haywire because those who own the online portals have become richer than anybody in history. And they need to give back now, not in the future, not during their lifetimes, but now in the greatest humanitarian disaster that the world has faced in more than a century. So I want to say we have to have a realistic view of the depth of this crisis and the billions of people whose lives have been profoundly disrupted, and the hundreds of millions of people struggling for survival, or struggling to get into school, or soon struggling to get a vaccine, or to have enough to eat. And then work with the MDBs, work with the International Monetary Fund, work with the UN core budget, and work with the richest people in the world to make sure that as a global society, we hold together. Let me stop there just to thank the wonderful panel that we have, some real global experts on these issues. And I want to give a special shout out to ILO for its leadership on social protection, and to Valerie Schmitt for all that she's been doing for many, many years on drawing attention to the need for special funding for social protection, one of the topics for today. Thank you very much, and back to you, George.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Both you and Edie have laid out the challenge that we are trying to discuss this morning. I'm not going to say more about this. You've defined the what of the challenge, where the issues are affecting millions, if not billions of people, and the how-to of dealing with them. But you've also brought out examples of where some successes are beginning to be realized at the country level and through the regional banks, for example. All in all, we are confounded by the growing inequality and the intersecting nature of this inequality. And it's on this basis that we would like to move into the panel discussion. And thanks very much. But before I introduce the panelists, I'd like to ask Madam President if you'd like to say a few opening words as well. Madam President.
Thank you very much. Thank you to both presenters, representing on the one hand the humanitarian efforts of UNICEF as part of the United Nations system, and Jeffrey Sachs as a renowned economist, some say one of the best that we have around in this past century. The link between the two, the economic resources that the world possesses and the needs, on the other hand, is somehow a very asymmetrical one. The distribution of wealth seems to be getting less and less equitable, and less corresponding to the real needs of societies worldwide. The concentration of wealth in increasingly a smaller number of hands, and the enormous growth of the wealth that they hold in comparison to the enormous unfulfilled needs of society. And since we have UNICEF today as partners in this webinar, of course, children will be an important part of the discussion. But the Lancet COVID-19 group, of which Jeff is leading and of which I am also part, is looking at all kinds of disadvantaged groups. The needs are dire. The costs are going to be enormous to answer to them. But the distribution of wealth in the world, I wonder how long it will remain sustainable in the manner that it has been proceeding during the year 2020. With that, we look forward to the presentations by our distinguished panelists, each with remarkably rich experience in their own field. And we look forward to being enriched by their thoughts and suggestions. I go back to George to introduce them.
Thank you very much, Madam President. And on that basis, I'd like to introduce the panelists. We have 4 of them, and they are top experts in their own field who would help us unpack many of the issues that Edie Fore, Professor Sachs, and Madam President have laid out. I'd like to start by introducing the first one, Professor Michael Samson. He's the director of the Economic Policy Research Institute, a global think tank based in Cape Town of South Africa. He's done a lot of work across countries, over 50 countries, on the issues that we are dealing with, in particular on social protection instruments that work in times of crisis and beyond. He's recently completed a review for Unicef of social protection responses to COVID in 23 countries. So he has some very fresh material, and he's talked to senior policymakers in all these countries, including the IFIs that Jeff has mentioned. Michael today will address questions around comprehensive social protection and the triple dividend that it could bring in tackling the shocks that have come with COVID-19. The second person I'd like to introduce is my colleague Natalia Winder-Rossi. She is the head of social policy in Unicef and oversees Unicef's social protection agenda. She's worked on various issues on child poverty, on public finance, as well as local governance. Previously, she led a similar function in FAO, and we are happy that she's joined us at the time that UNICEF and partners are trying to scale up their efforts in social protection. She's worked at the regional level as well, and is going to bring in her experience from the ground. So, Natalie, welcome. I'm also pleased to see our friend Dr. Ibrahim Abubakar with us this morning. He's the director of the University College of London Institute for Global Health, where he's led a lot of work on infectious diseases and epidemiology. And it's been a senior investigator in some of the clinical trials, important ones in the past. And he was the head of TB and has been the chair of the Lancet migration series. So Dr. Abubakar, we're happy to receive you this morning and look forward to how you're going to connect the dots between global health and the need for a major push in social protection globally. Lastly, our dear colleague Valerie Schmitt, who comes from ILO, the Deputy Director of Social Protection, who has led a major effort in the financing aspect. And she's been one of those championing for building social protection floors across the world. She's worked with many governments in this regard, and we are happy to have her unpack issues about how to invest more and invest in what interventions and how to sustain these investments. So colleagues, each panelist has about 7 minutes max to give a clear highlight about the key issues that the world is dealing with now, and help us lay out some concrete solutions that the Lancet COVID Commission can build on. In terms of flow, we will allow all the panelists to speak for a maximum of 7 minutes, and then we will open the floor for questions and answers. In the meantime, participants are kindly invited to use the Q&A box to add your questions, your inputs, your contributions as the presenters speak. The panelists are also invited to respond through the Q&A box, but we will also have the opportunity. My colleague Uyen is going to pull out some of the key questions after they speak, and each panelist will have the opportunity to address some of these. And all in all, our focus should be on actionable recommendations as we enter into a different phase of the crisis. Actionable recommendations at the country level and at the international level as well. So let me invite the first speaker, Professor Michael Samson. Mike, you have the floor now.
Thank you, George. Madam President, Executive Director, Professor Sachs, distinguished guests, thank you for the opportunity here to share this research with you. Over the next 7 minutes, I want to talk about how COVID-19 represents a powerful system of cascading and interacting shocks. Yes, an epidemiological shock, but more importantly, an indirect health shock that negatively affects women and children. Yes, an economic shock, but also a social and a political shock, and very much an uncertainty shock that has compressed the planning horizon in many countries to just a moment. And that's a problem, because as we just heard from the executive director, there are long-term consequences that are having severely negative impacts on children and adversely affecting gender equality. So I want to talk about how important this policy response is, because all around the world, most people have never met this coronavirus. And yet this single event is affecting more people than any shock in our lifetimes. And so I want to make the case for comprehensive social protection, providing a triple dividend, not only tackling the immediate consequences of the pandemic, but contributing to the medium and long-term developmental impacts, and even harnessing the power of the crisis to change adverse social norms and build back a better social contract. In our review, we've looked at multiple dimensions of deprivation. And as we've just heard from Professor Sachs, the impact on food security and nutrition may be the most devastating, affecting children's cognitive development and potentially risking intergenerational transmissions of vulnerability. It's been a human capital shock, and it's highlighted the vital importance of early childhood interventions. It involved a parallel pandemic of mental health shocks, of child abuse, of gender-based violence, and a whole series of negative economic effects, increasing gender inequality. When we look back 2 or 3 decades from now on the great pandemic of 2020, it's not the economic costs that will have caused the worst scars. The still festering wounds will result from these social costs, from the human capital shocks, the inequality shocks, the problems with mental health and gender-based violence. In our review, we've looked at a number of countries and we've quantified the impact on multidimensional child deprivation. We've seen it more than doubling in countries like Argentina, and countries that had low levels before more than tripling, like in Jordan. In South Africa, in the immediate aftermath of both the shock and the policy response, 3 out of 5 children face multiple deprivations. And this increased vulnerability is largely in households that had not faced multiple deprivation before. It represents a universal shock affecting households even the highest quintiles of society. And we've seen job losses affecting women in many countries disproportionately to men. Some analysts have argued that's because women are often working in sectors that have been hardest hit by the pandemic. That may be true, for example, in Cambodia, where women dominate the textiles and tourism industry. But in many countries, the sectoral impacts cannot explain the job losses for women. In fact, in a country like South Africa, the sectoral impact goes the other way and has affected men more, but still we see women affected 50% more than men on a relative basis. Part of that is because women are often in lower paid occupations and job positions, and firms have discriminated against. They have made economic decisions to invest in work from home options for higher paid employees, but not for the lower paid. But there's still most of that unexplained job loss differential is perhaps due to explicit discrimination against women, or as we heard from some key informants, a problem with a double burden for women who are working from home, who have to take care of children and deal with the lack of childcare. So millions of women have been dropping out of the labor force. The response around the world has been a massive expansion in social protection. We can think of social protection as a box within a box, the box of bigger vulnerabilities. And what countries around the world have done well has been vertical expansion, increasing the generosity of these existing programs. For example, South Africa significantly increased the benefit value of the child support grant, which also reaches a lot of the informal sector workers affected by these programs. We've also seen horizontal expansion, increasing the coverage of these programs. And the most successful ones of these have been universal. Universal programs are immediately responsive, they're inclusive, and perhaps most importantly, they contribute to broader-based developmental impacts. But the big challenge has been on that third dimension, diagonal expansion, integrating these core social protection programs with more developmental access to services and complementary programs. The pandemic has illustrated a devastating arithmetic. Crisis and adverse social norms increase gender and economic inequality. For example, this double burden I just mentioned, leading to women dropping out of the labor force, and these can reinforce adverse social norms. Comprehensive social protection can help tackle that, providing girls with resources to stay in school, providing women with childcare support so they can continue to work. And because the crisis can actually motivate the political will to act, comprehensive social protection can harness the power of the crisis. Compare a social services livelihood program to a typical public works program. Public works do not work well in the pandemic, but these social care services interventions can generate the same positive impact, but also provide more pro-poor services, provide the workers with a better career path, provide parents with childcare so they can engage better in the labor force, and actually tackle these social norms, providing a quintuple dividend. I want to conclude with 3 key points here. A universal shock requires a universal response. Universal child benefits are one of the most powerful instruments for tackling the long-term consequences of this pandemic. Around the world, we've seen a policy appetite for universal programs like never before. Second, technology can strengthen resilience in every dimension. There is not one domain we've studied where better digital inclusion, more equal access to everyone to the internet could not provide a better adaptive response. And finally, I want to reinforce the case for comprehensive social protection in achieving this triple dividend. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for the presentation and the clear conclusions and recommendations. I'd like to invite Professor Abubakar. I'm told you might have to leave us at some point. So if you could kindly come in at this stage. Thank you very much.
I had to unmute my microphone before I share screen. So many thanks for inviting me. I would take a very health lens because I understand the other speakers will be covering the other areas. But before I do so, I want to make the really important point that actually it isn't a choice between health and the wider determinants. Health is about the wider social determinants, and you can only get true health by tackling the wider determinants. So I'll start by sort of just reiterating the interrelationship between these factors and why we are where we are. Both in wealthy and poor countries, the outsized impact of COVID has been generated by this wider, more important social and structural determinants that mean that the poorest amongst us and the most vulnerable amongst us are living in poor, overcrowded conditions, leading to the higher likelihood of acquiring COVID, whether it's in detention settings or refugee camps, are doing jobs where they don't have a choice but to be in greater contact with others. And when we use public health interventions to ask people to isolate, the poorest and the most vulnerable are unable to do so. The economic precarity they live means that they really have to go out every single day. And other wider issues such as the impact on the economy and shock and the disappearance of remittances means that they really can't even eat or sustain their daily livelihoods. And those are the reasons why COVID has disproportionately affected the poorest. Of course, there are health system determinants. We have ample evidence, especially from wealthy countries, that the poor neighborhoods where minorities, migrants live have large numbers of cases that have died. We also have an outsized effect of the disease itself in the elderly who are vulnerable already. And we have issues around capacity and exclusion of various groups in health systems, especially in countries that cannot afford universal health coverage, with some subgroups even in wealthy countries struggling to access healthcare due to status around immigration or language barriers. Compounding all of this are pre-existing poor health and comorbidity and chronic diseases that are more common in the most vulnerable amongst us. So I want to take one case study before I go into a few key points on what I feel are the things we should be doing to respond, which is the subject of migrants, a subject that we've been working on within COVID as part of the Lancet Migration Commission that I chair. We've been doing case studies in a large number of countries across the 5 regions of the world and have detailed case studies done by local people in each country from 22 countries. And the summation of our experience is that while we've been lucky to get away with a lot of it and we haven't had massive outbreaks in camps and refugee settings, and we're really grateful to the fantastic work that UNHCR and other organizations are doing, there remains a distinct risk that this very vulnerable community would end up with outbreaks if we don't continue supporting and funding the efforts of organizations like UNHCR and others that work in those settings. Using Greece, for example, as a case study to just illustrate how we managed to get away with it, the outbreak of COVID started with a great deal of variation, but the data suggests that we have had limited outbreaks, and that's possibly because of the control measures that have been put in place, but also the relatively young age of the population. The situation is, however, less clear when you look at refugee or similar populations that are outside of those camps. And I believe that those populations may be suffering the combined consequences of both COVID-19 and the impact of lockdown. So I'd like to go on to the next part of my talk and summarize what I feel are the really key measures and reiterate that point I started with, that actually social protection has to combine both interventions in health as well as economic support for the vulnerable groups. And the wider determinants of health have to be the priority. We have to encourage countries to understand that it's only by tackling the wider determinants of health and the economy that we'll get the key human capital gain that we're after. From a public health perspective, I would also argue that we need to think carefully about a life course approach with specific support in any social intervention that targets children as well as the elderly, because they are more vulnerable and because there are opportunities to make a difference long-term to the economy if you support children. I think to minimize the health effects of COVID, we need to use this as an opportunity to say, actually, the shock to the system that has been created is a moment in our lifetimes that we should take a step back and say, should countries think about this as the one time in our lifetimes that we can think about universality? That means the vulnerable groups are provided with healthcare. Should we argue that a larger proportion of resources should be put towards universal access to health and to other amenities, and such as education to all? Should we go towards providing access to all vaccines, not just COVID vaccines? And when we talk about COVID vaccines, we should be all arguing towards prioritizing vulnerable groups in each country, not vaccine nationalism and focusing on the wealthiest countries. And please, let's all work towards no travel passports until vaccines are available to everyone. It is unethical to put restrictions on movement when in fact you haven't got access to the vaccines that allow you to travel. I'd like to finish by calling for more joined up action, that nations must protect the most vulnerable. It is our moral and ethical obligation to do so. I'm really proud of the effort of various multilateral agencies. Jeffrey Sachs has mentioned several of them, and I think that as a community, we have every obligation to support the UN agencies and the philanthropists to give even more to countries. We need better evidence in some of the areas in health, especially about the public health interventions. And my last word is universal access and inclusion in health protection for vulnerable groups will be key to success, including access to vaccines. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ibrahim, and for clearly linking the need for universal health care with comprehensive social protection. As Michael did before, there are a few action points that I'll come to in trying to wrap up this session. But let me invite Natalia Winder-Rossi, the head of social policy in UNICEF, to share her thoughts as well. Natalia, over to you now.
Many thanks, George, for the opportunity. It's an honor to be part of this critical discussion. Madam President, ED4, Professor Sachs, distinguished panelists, let me use the 7 minutes to briefly share perspective on the role of social protection and how we can take this crisis and turn it into an opportunity to really scale up the impact of social protection, particularly among children. I think, as we all have acknowledged with these presentations and introductory remarks, we know that we are in a particular context, a health and socioeconomic crisis that is really taking us back many years of progress, particularly around SDG 1. A lot of pushback in terms of more than around 88 to 115 million people expected to be in extreme poverty by the end of the year. Disproportionate impacts across different groups, such as the self-employed, the informal sector, women, but also children, which we can say are the silent victims of the pandemic. Our analysis is showing that we are expected to see an additional 140 million children falling into extreme monetary poverty by the end of the year. And this is, of course, on top to all the already multiple impacts on school closures, disruption in education and nutrition services, increase in GBV and child violence, and mental health related issues affecting children as well as adolescents. And we also know, thanks to the support and the commitment of many countries, that social protection has been a critical pillar in the immediate response, where more than 200 countries have responded either through their national systems or creating new programs. We know that I think the bulk of the response has been focused on social assistance and things like cash transfers or in-kind transfers, as well as very interesting innovations in terms of social insurance and others. I think it's a reflection or a highlighting that really governments are able to effectively and rapidly respond with existing systems, a confirmation that when there is political will, there is financing. And I think also confirming the important protection role the social protection plays, particularly in context of crises, addressing critical income and employment losses, as well as helping to absorb new out-of-pocket health costs in terms of prevention and treatment, as well as the additional care costs. But also, I think very importantly, minimizing the impossible choice or around following social distance protocols or going to work. And I think maybe confirming the very strong evidence that have come in from our different partnerships, including from the work in Unicef, on the very clear impact that social protection has across different outcomes in terms of health, education, access to nutrition, gender equity, but also I think very critically in enhancing the economic and productive capacity of the poorest and generating important multiplier effects in the local economy. So a social intervention that is helping to manage risk, to further social incomes, as well as to enhance economic potential. And I think we've been fortunate enough to work very closely with countries and UN agencies to help countries and governments in enhancing this response, either by developing new emergency programs, such as the case of Guatemala, using the opportunity to link these programs with critical additional services, such as prevention of GBV and support to victims in Sierra Leone, as well as using the response and the commitment to further establish structured policies and strategies around social protection, such as the case of Jordan. Despite this very important and I think commendable response, I think that the crisis has also put very clearly on the table that there are gaps in the social protection system. In terms of coverage, I think our executive director very clearly showed that we still see 2 out of 3 children that do not have access to any form of social protection. And then when we look even more specifically, children from a specific vulnerable groups that are systematically excluded from protection, such as those on the move, from ethnic groups, indigenous peoples, children with disability, among others. And the still very critical challenge that we have in building strong systems in fragile and humanitarian contexts. We also have gaps in terms of adequacy, in terms of the effective reach, in terms of addressing some of the very specific vulnerabilities that are facing those working in the informal sector, in the care economy, which was already in crisis prior to the pandemic, and that continues to be a challenge today. A focus on the systems approach, and I think that's linked to the presentation of the professor in terms of that we are key in focusing on the social and economic elements of the social protection system, that there's other very critical components of the system that now also requires strengthening and financing, such as health insurance, such as the care economy, and the better linkage between those 2 systems. But I think, and echoing Professor Sachs' points, that we also saw the very obvious fiscal gap. Even though the current fiscal space allowed for an unprecedented response, we also are seeing that this response is short-term, it is limited, that a very small portion of some of the stimulus plans, although very critical, has not necessarily gone to the most vulnerable and to critical sectors that require specific attention and prioritization. What to do? I think we are in a moment we're not only looking at the need to reverse the negative trends that we're seeing in terms of SDG 1 and 10, but also accelerate progress to meet our goals by 2030. We're asking countries to do more and better, and for that there has to be definitely a change in perspective in terms of financing, if we really are truly committed to an inclusive and sustainable recovery. And from UNICEF, from a financing side, we're really calling for an inclusive recovery for every child, at a minimum to protect and safeguard investment in the social sector with a specific focus on social protection. Children should be the first to be protected and the last to be impacted by cuts. Second, continue to work in partnership with IFIs and with our different social sectors and finance ministries to enhance the efficiency of the existing resources, enhancing the credibility of the sectors and strengthening transparency and monitoring, but also be bolder and identifying new financing options that can all really allow us to make the innovations and the changes in the systems that we need to see, even thinking about a very strong push around the debt relief and restructuring on that implications. I think that we're all convinced, and I think governments across the world have seen that social protection is a pillar for emergency response, but I think it also should be this at the center of inclusive recovery and building back better. So not only looking at it as an emergency program, but as a pillar of recovery and resilience. We have to, I think, enhance our commitment to financing and really commit to scale up and innovate in terms of design and implementation. Prioritize investments that are not only looking for systems to be able to respond, but also to be prepared and to deliver better in a much more efficient way. Put our heads together to really make a commitment around addressing some of the critical gaps in terms of coverage and echoing Michael's points about really calling for the realization of universal benefits as the core basis to provide support. And promote the innovation across mixed financing mechanisms to really enhance the adequacy and the impacts of social protection across different groups. So not just within the context of universality, looking at the specific vulnerabilities that are not allowing the extreme poor, those that remain populations that remain excluded, to eventually move out of poverty and thrive. I thank you for the attention and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Natalia, for drawing attention to the multiplier effect that social protection can bring, and for laying out some of the concrete actions that need to be taken. We'll invite Valerie, our colleague Valerie Schmitt, to have the floor now. She's been doing a lot of work around the world as well in this area for years. And Valerie, over to you now.
Thank you so much for giving me the floor, and thanks a lot. And I'm really pleased to be with you this afternoon. I mean, in Geneva, it's already the afternoon. So as most of the speakers have said already, COVID-19 has alerted the global community to the crucial importance of social protection. It has also shown that it's not only the poor who are in need of social protection, but all members of society from all countries. Everybody can become vulnerable in the absence of universal and comprehensive social protection. And this was, I think, stressed by Michael Samson. Prior to COVID-19, we were well aware of the lack of social protection globally, and we were not sleepwalking. But despite global awareness, there was insufficient political will to make social protection a policy priority. And COVID-19 has at least been beneficial for one reason. It has put social protection high on government's agenda and agencies' response to the crisis, as Natalia explained. We have seen once again that countries that already had well-designed social protection systems in place were able to rapidly guarantee access to healthcare and ensure income security through sickness benefits, for instance, unemployment benefits, or cash transfers. And countries that didn't have these strong systems in place had to innovate, and sometimes with a lot of improvisation. But what is clear is that all countries have done something on social protection. They have really used social protection as a priority response to the crisis. At the ILO, we have a social protection monitor that monitors really the COVID-19 crisis response. And we can see that within a few months, nearly 1,600 social protection emergency measures have been adopted in 209 countries. Togo, for instance, launched a new program called Novici, which means mutual help, to support informal economy workers that were most affected by the lockdown measures. So if there's a positive aspect to this crisis, it's obviously the widespread recognition of the value of social protection and its necessity. And as Natalia said, the determination to build back better. So the crisis has really taught us that with political will, countries can indeed make social protection a reality. However, the COVID-19 emergency measures have only been temporary, and they are only temporary, providing income support and access to healthcare to previously excluded populations. In Bangladesh, for instance, a temporary cash allowance program that is currently being implemented by the Ministry of Labor with ILO support and financial support from the EU and the government of Germany will provide unemployment benefits to garment sector workers, mostly female workers, that were prior to the crisis excluded from social protection. As you know, in Bangladesh, there is still no national social protection system. However, these measures, of course, they are really useful and needed, but they are temporary, and they will not be enough to protect people in the aftermath of the crisis, or even in the next months if the crisis continues a few more months. So countries should use, as Natalia said, the current political momentum and transform these temporary measures into sustainable social protection systems. If they are not doing it now, it will be too late. So it's really now or never. The problem, of course, is that the challenges are huge. Coverage gaps, as Natalia said, are immense. Even before COVID-19, at the ILO, we estimated that 55% of the world's population was excluded from social protection, which means that 4 billion people have nothing to rely on. In some regions, like in Africa, for instance, it's not 55%, it's 82% of the population that has no social protection at all. And what is clear as well is that these large gaps in coverage are linked actually to insufficient investments by the countries themselves in their social protection. We have estimated the financing gaps for social protection, and we have, so it's social protection including access to healthcare and income security, such as pensions, disability allowances, child benefits, etc. And we estimate that in low-income countries, the financing gap for this year are of US $78 billion, which means 16%, 1/6, of the low-income countries' GDP. So this is the amount of money that is needed to close the financing gap for social protection and access to healthcare. And if you look at all the low and middle income countries, this financing gap represents $1.2 trillion US. So you can see that there's a lot more investments that needs to be committed. If we look at Africa, the current investments in social protection and healthcare represent 5.6% of the country's GDP. And the African countries should actually move from 5.6 to, they should add an additional 8.2% of their GDP if they really want to achieve the SDGs on social protection and access to healthcare. So SDG 1.3 and 3.8, which means that they need to multiply by 2.5 their current investment in social protection and access to healthcare. So we are, with COVID-19, we have seen a lot of international solidarity in response to COVID-19 crisis, especially bulks of money coming into low and middle income countries. But if we have a closer look at the figures, first, out of the huge pledges, it's only 126 billion that have been allocated to countries as of end of September 2020. So maybe now it's a little bit more, but 126 billion that have been really allocated to countries. And of course, only a share of this money went to social protection because there was many other priorities. So if you do a quick calculation, this amount represents only 11% of the financing gap for social protection. And second point, the money allocated, 97% of this financial support is in the form of loans or concessional loans. So which means that only 3% is in the form of grants, which means that, of course, the countries will have to pay back. So we need to invest more in social protection. if we really want to achieve the SDGs on social protection and health by 2030. And obviously, to be sustainable, these additional investments should come primarily from national domestic resources. So it means that countries really have to prioritize the increase of domestic resource for social protection. This can be done by many ways, and many of these avenues have not yet been fully explored. Of course, we all know about the reallocation of public spending, such as from fuel subsidies to social protection programs, or the creation of new earmarked taxes, such as on natural resources. But there are many other ways of increasing fiscal space for social protection, including through new income tax, wealth taxes, and I'm sure that Jeffrey Sachs has talked about that in the introduction. One promising path is the extension of contributory social protection to workers in the informal economy, which would reduce the need for social assistance while increasing the contribution and tax base in the country and formalizing the economy. For instance, if we go back to the example of the Novici program in Togo that I was mentioning, discussions are now underway on how to build on this emergency measure that is for workers in the informal economy, a way to incentivize informal economy workers to join the contributory social insurance scheme that are being implemented for workers in the informal sector and small and medium enterprises. However, so these efforts in increasing domestic resources need to be reinforced, but for low-income countries, it may be difficult to meet the financing gap within only 10 years, because we have only 10 years left until 2030. So what we are claiming for is that these countries should really be able to seek international financial support, at least for a few years, for a temporary period. And this would not be helicopter money used to pay cash transfers, etc. This should really be used to support national counterparts in mobilizing their own domestic resources for social protection and to create sustainable social protection systems. So if you look at Kenya, between 2007 and 2016, the government, in line with its national social protection policy, has indeed allocated more resources to social protection and progressively reduced its reliance on external funding. So this idea of progressively increasing domestic resources for social protection while international financial support is decreasing is possible. So investing more is crucial, and Natalia has said it, but it's not sufficient. We also need to invest better in social protection, because we need that both the way you collect funding, domestic resources for social protection or international resources for social protection, and the way you reallocate, you redistribute the resources is fair and equitable, because social protection, it's not only about risk pooling, it's also about solidarity redistribution. So investing better for the ILO and for many others, it means, for instance, that we need to embed the social protection system in solidarity in financing between the rich and the poor, of course, but also between those who have a good health and those with preconditions, or between those who are working and those who are retired, for instance, or those who are unemployed. Investing better also means that the social protection system is not only sustainable financially, but also socially, which means that it should be embedded in a social contract. All the members of society should share a same vision for their social protection system, so that they can really adhere to this social protection, comply with the rules, etc. So to invest more and invest better, and there has been a lot of discussions since September, because Olivier de Schutter, the UN representative for human rights, and also the government of France, as part of the G20 discussions, have organized a number of discussions on what could we do to really close these financing gaps. And one of the clear message is that we need a greater coordinated action between ministries of labor, social welfare, health on one side, and ministries of finance on the other hand, so that all these government stakeholders can share a common vision and a common roadmap for the development of sustainable social protection systems. investing more, investing better also needs that at the global level, those who are providing technical assistance on social protection, such as ILO, Unicef, EPRI, and many others, and those who are advising ministries of finance on the other side, such as the IFIs and the IMF in particular, avoid conflicting messages and conflicting policy advice, and really try to link the policy support with the financial support. And this is why, together with UNICEF, we are now implementing a relatively large project financed by the EU on linking social protection and public finance management. And actually the Global Coalition, which includes 100 NGOs working really on social protection flows, is also part of this effort. So,
Valerie,
yeah?
if you don't mind, I'd ask you to try and wrap up, so we have a little time for a discussion.
Yeah, I will wrap up now. So my main message is that we need to invest more, but we need to also invest better. We cannot stop where we are today. It's actually the beginning. It's as Natalia said, an opportunity to build back better. We really need to coordinate better and to have a common roadmap that could be embedded in international social security standards that have been adopted at the international level. And one of them that most of you, I think, know is the recommendation 202 on social protection floors, which really provides a number of guiding principles to really invest more, invest better in social protection. In the wake of the 2008 global financial crisis, the UN had reaffirmed its commitment to the right to social security. This is why we had launched the Social Protection Floors Initiative. It is now high time to put money behind these words and to follow a common roadmap to make social protection a reality for all. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valerie. Colleagues, we have a few minutes to respond to the questions that have come in either the Q&A or chat box, and possibly, if we manage the time well, we might have the chance to also hear from some of you. I'm going to ask my colleague Uyen to try and pull out some of the questions that have come up, and then the panelists will respond. And then, if as I've mentioned, if we make use of the time, we'll be able to hear one or two people from the floor. After all this, Madam President will help us draw some key conclusions and close the meeting. We will try to be on time, to close on time, meaning we have about 12 minutes to do all these. Uyen, do you want to come in with some of the issues that have been raised in the Q&A and chat box?
Sure. There have been questions that have been upvoted, so let me just start with some of those. A question for Professor Samson: could you expand on your point on the digital gap? Could it be an opportunity to further strengthen and enable greater coverage of social protection?
Yes, that's an excellent question. Social protection has focused to a large extent in response to this pandemic on cash transfers, but well-being producing information transfers may be even more important as complements to this. There is no sector of impact where better access to digital technologies could not have better reduced vulnerability. So yes, an initiative to ensure every household is connected to the internet could offer enormous promise in promoting greater resilience.
Thank you very much. This question is health related. So Professor Abubakar, maybe you can take this one. COVID reflects the deficit in broken systems, such as x-rays and healthcare and economies especially. Do you think COVID can reassure the role of government in managing running economies, a better role in allocating budgets, not just to regulate the market? I hope I've capture that question well.
Indeed. So for the first time in our lifetimes, a health issue has actually brought countries to a standstill and economies to a standstill. I think it is a moment of reflection and rethinking the fundamental of economics and whether, in fact, the market as is able to generate the sort of public good needed for universal access for all mankind. And I think it's a legitimate question to ask our super economists to reflect on whether, in fact, there is a need to balance the power of the market versus actually the state. As my colleague, Professor Mariana Mazzucato would say, the state should have a stake in what the private sector does in a very active way so that when the private sector generates or the market generates capital and some of it is financed by the state, that can be redirected as a public good. I think it's also an opportunity to say, can we revisit concepts as basic as can wealthy states and wealthy economies that generate wealth actually distribute income? Does everybody really need to work to be able to earn a minimum wage? Or have we reached a stage where we can reflect on the need for labor as the necessary reason for having the basic minimum means to live in life? I think those are very, very valid questions. And I think this massive health shock to society has brought them to the fore, and we should be having those discussions.
Thank you very much. The next question's a two-part, and I think Valerie and Natalia can both address this. UNICEF released a report today showing that during the first wave of the pandemic, only 2% of the government provided financial relief in high-income countries was allocated specifically to support children and families, and around 90% allocated for businesses. How can we begin to address this imbalance in the response? We know that this approach didn't work in response to the GFC, and austerity had a very harming and lasting effect on children. How can we prevent this from being repeated? Maybe Valerie, over to you first, and then Natalia.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, indeed. I mean, we are at the ILO, we are, as you know, a tripartite organization. And so we are working also closely with representatives of the business and representatives of workers. And I mean, this uneven prioritization on with prioritizing business and economy not so much the people can be explained maybe in a context where, because I think you were talking about the high level countries, in a context where social protection systems are already in place and where they can normally play their function of protecting people in case of unemployment, in case of sickness benefits, which was not the case in low-income countries. So this is why the ILO, together with business and workers' organizations and brands, has launched a call to action, for instance, just to give you an example, in the garment sector, to really ensure that there can be a real dialogue on how to support not only businesses during the crisis, but also the workers. And we are implementing this call to action in 8 countries, including Bangladesh, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Cambodia, for instance, where actually concrete actions, including financing support, are provided to support the businesses, to ensure that there is a business continuity during the crisis, but also to support the workers that are temporarily or permanently laid off. And what is interesting is that there is the recognition that this is a shared responsibility of governments, of course, workers, employers, and also the brands that are buying to the suppliers in these supply chains. Over.
Thank you, Dan. Maybe briefly and complementing Valerie's response, I think all the panelists are very aligned in critically calling for the recognition of the role that social protection plays in the recovery. I think we've seen that it's critical from a social justice perspective, from a social perspective, but also from an economic investment case perspective. And I think that is we need to definitely avoid repeating the mistakes that we did in the previous crises, where we were focusing on cutting, on austerity measures, and really seeing support to businesses and creation of jobs different to investments in human capital and social protection. And from us, it's something that has to come hand in hand, that they're complementary, and really putting on the table the clear economic repercussions that investing in programs such as social protection has, and can also allow to generate the capacity, even of the poorest, even of the most marginalized, even of the labor constrained, to contribute to that reconstruction and slowly start to rebuild their livelihood. So I think it's an important mindset that we need to put on the table and very strongly push, that it's not an option between one or the other. It's a complementary intervention to really ensure inclusive recovery. Thank you.
Thank you. We just have a few minutes left, but I want to ask this question because this task force also encompasses humanitarian action as well as vulnerable groups. And this question, perhaps Professor Abubakar and Michael could address: what is the current situation in Afghanistan? With winter approaching, there are concerns that the second wave will create dangerous implications for communities who are still struggling to make it through the first wave. Kabul remains the most affected part of the country in terms of confirmed cases. However, due to limited public resources and testing capacity, as well as the absence of a national death register, confirmed cases and deaths from COVID-19 are likely to be underreported in the country. And this can be applied to many countries. So over to you, Professor Abubakar.
Yes, so actually, this is an issue I was reflecting on quite recently on a WHO committee, that we should not use the levels of testing to determine prioritization of resource, especially as we know for many countries in sub-Saharan Africa and other countries that are low to middle income have low levels of testing. Therefore, it could be a misleading indicator, and we don't have the luxury of having good death records. So it's clearly my view that when we are thinking about solutions, both economic in terms of social protection and access to resources, but also importantly in how we distribute vaccines globally, that we choose to prioritize countries that have challenges such as Afghanistan and many countries across sub-Saharan Africa. We should not just simply rely on the number of test positives that we know is highly variable across the world.
Thanks. And Michael, maybe if you could address what you had mentioned earlier about addressing the shock, but what might be needed for these humanitarian contexts in terms of creating a longer term strategy.
Exactly. This is a good example of one of the countries that will not have the national resources to finance the necessary social protection response. It points, first of all, to the need for changing global fiscal norms to ensure proper resourcing. Professor Sachs highlighted the enormous inequality this crisis has generated. Natalia pointed out that this creates an opportunity to change the global resourcing framework to ensure countries like Afghanistan and many other countries get these necessary resources. But this needs to build the link between the humanitarian and the development response so that these interventions not only respond to the immediate crisis, but look to the medium and long term and generate that triple dividend by promoting developmental outcomes and ultimately changing the kinds of norms that create this pressing vulnerability.
Thank you very much, Michael. I think we'll leave it there because we would like to provide a few minutes for Madam President to make her closing remarks. All the content of this webinar will be distributed and available on the Global Development Commons website. Over to you, Madam President.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you very much to our distinguished panelists who have not only presented factual information about where we stand, each from their experience and from their point of view, but have come with very concrete recommendations as to what countries should be doing, what the world should be doing. And in the introduction, we also heard that from Madame Henrietta Fore and from Jeffrey Sachs, both from the economic and from the humanitarian point of view. If I may pick up some of the very important points that have been raised in this discussion, I might start with Professor Michael Samson's idea of a series of shocks that has been produced, or if you like, in different words, we have a pandemic on our hands, which so far is out of control in many parts of the world. To start, we have not talked about the pandemic in the panel, but it may be worth repeating and reminding ourselves that certain epidemiologists, when the pandemic started and was officially declared by the WHO, WHO, sorry, the provision was that there would be a high peak sometime in June, and then a very steep decrease in the number of cases. And that the idea was to stay ahead of the curve, as the saying goes, and that should somehow contain the epidemic. If you look at distributions of both infected cases and fatalities, I have counted in many cases 3 different waves. In other words, a rising peak, which then does descend to a certain level, but then rises again. And this is repeated at least 3 times between the month of March and now the beginning of December. So that and in Europe, the so-called second wave, which is possibly a third wave, really is practically out of control in many places, so that the impact, the cascading impact of this pandemic on the economy, on the social welfare of populations, on the mental health of populations, on the very survival and the access to food and water and minimal essentials to life is continuing to be acute. And it's only next year that vaccinations will be able to take on any kind of scope. And we can look forward to another very difficult year during which, in many places, things will get worse before they get better. Professor Ibrahim Abubakar has pointed out that the impact of the pandemic has laid bare the deficiencies of social policy and protection arrangements in different countries. Of course, the baseline varies greatly between different countries. Even some rich countries like the United States of America, frankly, have, I would say, not very impressive social protection for their citizens compared to a country like Sweden or Finland. There are huge differences in the baselines, and of course, the poorest countries of the world are the most affected. But in every country across the globe, it is the poor, those who are poor and deprived in the first place, including migrants, refugees, various other vulnerable groups have been affected the most. But as was pointed out also by other presenters, the impact has not been the same for all parts of society. The aged, the elders are most vulnerable in terms of morbidity and lethality, but children are the most vulnerable in the sense of these are a period in their life, these months that have gone by, will leave traces for deficiencies in their education, deficiencies in socialization for those who do not go to school, possibly poor diet, which can easily, 1 year can be sufficient to ruin a child's health and leave lasting consequences in years to follow. And the cascade goes on in terms of negative effects. Madame Natalia Winder-Rossi from Unicef has pointed out that the people sinking into poverty are in over 100 million expected. These are estimates, of course, who knows, there may be actually more of them. Now, while more than 200 countries have responded, as she pointed out, the response that they have offered varies both in the quality, the quantity, and the efficiency of the outreach in terms of reaching people. And Madam Valerie Schmitt, the Deputy Director of Social Protection at ILO, has reminded us that 82% of people in Africa do not have any kind of social protection at all. So that any crisis, be it a pandemic or anything else whatsoever, a downturn in the economy worldwide would have a much more dramatic negative effect on their lives and on their outlook for the future than anywhere else in the world. Madam Schmitt also pointed out that it is important for countries that do not have them to think about contributory social protection policies. I know that in the years when I was in office, we were still in a post-communist sort of phase in Eastern Europe and in parts of Central Asia. And people did not have the concept of needing to contribute, to make contributions and payments to unemployment insurance, to the old age pension fund of the state, because the communist governments had been telling them, if you like, acting like Santa Claus and pretending that the state covers everything, the Communist Party looks after you, the state will give you social protection. When you look in terms of the quality of life that people had in these countries, of course, it was appalling. And the whole thing was a lie. But the unfortunate effect was that people did not have that concept, which, for instance, in the Scandinavian countries is deeply entrenched. That solidarity that our panelists was talking about between members of society, where when one is fortunate enough to have a job and have a salary, that is the time to make contributions to a common fund, which will be part of paying you. And besides, by the way, paying taxes as well, which some think is an imposition on them. Why should they be paying taxes? The government should take care of everything. Well, governments do derive their income from taxes. And from printing money, I suppose, there's that. And Jeff Sachs was talking about this borrowing on our future, which is now going on, while the richer countries that can afford it and have foreign reserves, they can afford to be printing money and to drive the future generations deeper into debt. But the situation for poorer countries is even worse than that. But ladies and gentlemen, I think that these wonderful presentations that we have heard today have given as much food for thought to you all who are participating as they have to me, and that they have raised various questions about how the world is not the way it ought to be in terms of social equity, of the dignity of every human being, of the equal chances of every child who is born anywhere on this planet. We do not have it yet. We do need to be aware of it. And yes, it's not a crisis that one would wish upon the world in order to make things better, but it is a crisis that is making it imperative that we make things better in terms of social protection for all parts of society, not just the rich and the super rich and the comfortable and the middle class, but everybody without exception. 10 years to go to the 2030 goals is a short time. I think it would be dreaming in color to think that we will have accomplished everything by that very short lapse of time. But I think that the aims that have been presented in these Sustainable Development Goals are something we should keep in mind. And the effects, these cascading effects of the pandemic, should urge us on truly and ring the alarm bells to get busy improving things so that every citizen of every country did not be left alone in distress without anybody to help them. Thank you very much for participating, and I wish you success, good health, and especially wonderful ideas in solving the problems of the world. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam President. So, colleagues, this brings an end to our discussion, and again, on behalf of the Lancet Commission on COVID, specifically the task force on vulnerable groups and the Global Development Commons at Unicef, I'd like to thank panelists, Michael, Natalia, Ibrahim, Valerie, for the discussion. It's been very rich, as Madam President has said, and we look forward to possibly a deeper dive on some of the issues, like humanitarian context, like the needs of specific groups in society. So thanks again to acknowledge those who organize this, Wian, and Osge, who is behind the scenes. Thanks, and have a good rest of morning, afternoon, evening. And for those that is night, have a good night. Thanks very much, and we'll see you at another time. Bye for now.
Bye for now. Thank you.